Welcome to our channel, Africarized. Today, we're diving into a dark and often overlooked chapter of history. African rulers who sold their own people into slavery. This isn't about glorifying the horrors of slavery, but about understanding the complex historical figures and the difficult conversations that still resonate today. We're going to journey back in time, peel back the layers of history, and uncover the stories behind these controversial figures. We'll explore the motivations, the pressures, and the justifications used during a period of immense global change. It's a story that's often oversimplified, but we're here to unpack it together. So, buckle up, because we're about to take a trip through history that's as fascinating as it is heartbreaking. Let's get into it. Let's kick things off with King Gzo Of Dhomi, who ruled from 1818 to 1858. Now, Gzo was a bit of a contradiction. He was known for his military prowess, expanding Dhomi's territory and influence. But he was also a staunch defender of the slave trade. He saw the slave trade as an integral part of Dhomi's economy, a necessary evil, if you will. He argued that it brought in much-needed wealth and resources to his kingdom. And to be fair, in the context of the time, European demand for slaves was high, and Gzo was determined to capitalize on it. Gzo didn't discriminate when it came to who he sold into slavery: captives from neighboring tribes, sold, internal criminals, you guessed it, shipped off. He even had a standing army, the Dhomi Amazons, fierce female warriors who captured slaves for him. The Dhomi Amazons were the real deal, trained from a young age to be ruthless warriors, feared throughout the region. They were instrumental in expanding Gzo's empire and sadly in fueling the slave trade. Gzo's reign saw Dhomi become a major slave trading hub. European traders flocked to his ports, eager to exchange goods for human beings. But here's the thing about Gzo's story. It highlights the complex and often brutal realities of the time. He was a product of his environment, a ruler who saw the slave trade as a means to an end, a way to strengthen his kingdom and ensure its survival. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Africarized. Next up, we travel to the Kingdom of Congo, where a different kind of ruler grappled with the slave trade. Meet King Afonso I, also known as Nzinga Mbemba, a man who initially opposed the trade but ultimately succumbed to its pressures. Afonso's story is one of internal conflict, of a ruler torn between his conscience and the realities of power in a rapidly changing world. He ascended to the throne in 1509, embracing Christianity and forging alliances with the Portuguese, who were already heavily involved in the slave trade. At first, Afonso tried to play nice with the Portuguese while also protecting his people. He saw the economic benefits of trade, but he was horrified by the enslavement of his subjects. He wrote letters to the King of Portugal, pleading for an end to the illegal slave trade, condemning the practice as inhumane and detrimental to his kingdom. But here's the catch-22. Afonso also needed the Portuguese. They provided him with weapons, goods, and military support, things he needed to maintain his power and fend off rivals. So he found himself caught in a web of his own making, reliant on those who were exploiting his people. As pressure from the Portuguese mounted, and as internal rebellions threatened his rule, Afonso made a fateful compromise. He allowed the Portuguese to establish slave trading posts in his kingdom, turning a blind eye to their activities while officially condemning the illegal enslavement of his people. However, Afonso drew a line in the sand. He insisted that any slaves traded had to be captives of war, not his own subjects. Afonso's story is a tragic reminder of the impossible choices forced upon African rulers during this period. Now let's head over to the Kingdom of Benin, in present-day Nigeria, where the Obas, the traditional rulers, had a unique approach to the slave trade. These guys were all about playing the long game, maintaining their power by carefully balancing their involvement in the trade while trying to protect their interests. The Obas were shrewd diplomats and businessmen. They saw the slave trade as a way to accumulate wealth and forge alliances with European powers like the Portuguese, Dutch, and later the British. But they also recognized the dangers of becoming too reliant on it, so they did what any savvy ruler would do: they hedged their bets. The Obas engaged in the slave trade, but they also traded other goods like ivory, pepper, and textiles. This diversified their economy and gave them some leverage in their dealings with Europeans. They weren't afraid to play hardball either. When European traders got too demanding or tried to meddle in their affairs, the Obas weren't afraid to cut them off, banning the slave trade altogether for periods of time. It was their way of saying, look, we're in charge here and we'll do business on our terms. The Obas also understood the importance of controlling the narrative. They carefully managed the image of the kingdom, presenting themselves as powerful and sophisticated rulers to their European counterparts. They weren't just passive participants in the trade, they were active players, shaping the terms of engagement. But let's be clear, while the Obas may have been skilled negotiators, they were still complicit in the slave trade. The story of the Obas of Benin reminds us that the slave trade wasn't a simple transaction between Europeans and Africans. Let's rewind a bit and go back to Dahomey, where another ruler, King Tebu, left his mark on the slave trade. Taking the throne in 1740, Tebu inherited a kingdom already deeply involved in the trade, but he took it to a whole new level. You see, Tebu was ambitious. He wasn't content with just maintaining Dahomey's position. He wanted to make it a regional powerhouse. And what better way to do that than by expanding the army and amassing wealth? Now, where did he get the resources for this grand vision? You guessed it, the slave trade. Tebu ramped up slave raids on neighboring kingdoms, capturing thousands of people and selling them into slavery to European traders. He even implemented a rather horrifying policy: annual slave tributes. Neighboring kingdoms had to cough up a certain number of slaves every year as a sign of submission to Dahomey. Tebu used the profits from the slave trade to strengthen his army, purchasing firearms and gunpowder from Europeans. This gave him a significant military advantage over his rivals, allowing him to expand Dahomey's territory and influence. He also invested in infrastructure, building roads and fortifications to consolidate his power. Tebu's reign was a period of both prosperity and brutality for Dahomey. His story is a stark reminder of how the slave trade fueled ambition and enabled rulers like him to build empires on the backs of others. So far we've focused on the big players, the kings and rulers who dominated the slave trade, but the story doesn't end there. Scattered across West and Central Africa, countless local chiefs and leaders played a significant, albeit less grand, role in this dark chapter of history. These weren't kings with vast armies and sprawling palaces. They were smaller-scale rulers, often vying for power and influence in their own regions. And for many of them, the slave trade presented an opportunity, a way to consolidate their power, eliminate rivals, and gain access to coveted European goods. Imagine this: you're a local chief, struggling to maintain control over your territory. Your neighbor, another ambitious chief, is eyeing your land and your people. You know that to survive, you need an edge, something to tip the balance of power in your favor. Enter the European slave traders, offering guns, gunpowder, textiles, and other goods in exchange for one thing: human beings. Now you're faced with a moral dilemma. Do you resist the temptation, knowing it could mean your downfall? Or do you make a deal with the devil, sacrificing the freedom of your own people to preserve your own position? For many local chiefs, the choice was clear. They engaged in slave raids, capturing people from neighboring villages and even their own communities, selling them into slavery to acquire the means to protect their own interests. It's a brutal reality, but one that underscores the complex web of motivations at play during the slave trade. These local chiefs, often overlooked in the grand narrative of the slave trade, remind us that this wasn't just a story of powerful kings and European empires. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more historical insights. Let us know in the comments what other topics you'd like us to cover. Today, we've journeyed back in time, exploring the complex and often uncomfortable history of African rulers who participated in the slave trade. We've seen how they grappled with impossible choices, how they were shaped by the forces of their time, and how their actions continue to spark debate and reflection. This isn't about pointing fingers or judging the past by today's standards. It's about understanding the nuances of history, recognizing the humanity of even the most flawed individuals, and learning from the mistakes of the past to build a better future. Let's learn from each other and continue to unpack the complexities of our shared history.